Order.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to take a moment to speak to this motion. Obviously, there are a lot of things going on here, but at the heart of it, I think it has to do with artists or creators and discoverability online, and making sure that any sort of regulations that are put in place do not infringe upon their charter rights or the charter rights of those who might view that content. It's interesting to me that in this committee, when Section 4.1 was removed, there wasn't a unanimous call to hear from the artists. And I think that's very sad, because their voices have been ignored, and they are going to be largely impacted by this piece of legislation. So there's this whole world of digital first creators whose voices haven't been invited to the table. And we are, here at the 11th hour before this legislation gets rammed through, and we haven't even heard from them. And how sad is that? To not hear from this group that is going to be dramatically impacted by this legislation. And so, that being the case, I mentioned earlier at this committee that I've taken it upon myself to reach out to these individuals and to hear their voices. And there's one in particular that I would like to bring to this committee's attention as we continue to consider the amendment that is on the table by my colleague, Mr. Reyes. And it comes from an organization called Skyship Entertainment. And this letter was written and submitted to me just within the last couple of days here. It is from someone by the name of Morgan Fortier, and this individual is the CEO of Skyship Entertainment, which is an award-winning entertainment company owned and operated in Canada. And of course, they're using non-traditional media platforms. I'm going to read it into the record because, again, I believe that it's very important for this committee to consider the words of this individual. As one of Canada's top 2 YouTube creators, we are a proud example of how Canadian content can be successfully exported to the rest of the world. Our educational content enriches the lives of over 30 million viewers around the world every single day.
Point of order, Chair. Just a moment.
Oui, excusez-moi, Monsieur le Président, puis ma collègue.
I'm so sorry, Chair, and I certainly don't want to interrupt my colleague, but just to be sure I understand correctly the interpretation, given that the interpreters don't have the document, would it be possible for her to read just a little slower? Regarding this point of order myself, Mr. Champoux? Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, along the same line of thinking, I would invite our colleague, Mr. Reyes, also to help our interpreters to please wear his headphones and his microphone, please, as appropriate. Thank you, Chair.
I didn't even notice, Mr. Reyes, you had it on. Okay, you now have your, okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Champoux. And Mr. Reyes also brings up a good point about the pace of the reading. Yes, Ms. Harder, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Our educational content enriches the lives of over 30 million viewers around the world every single day on YouTube alone. Additionally, we're one of the world's top children's music artists, and our content can be found on streaming services such as Amazon Prime, Roku, and Tubi, to name a few. We produce nearly all of our content in-house at our Toronto production studio, where we employ over 30 writers, musicians, designers, animators, and puppeteers. We operate with no debt, no investors, and to date, we have never received any of the government support that traditional Canadian TV broadcasters and producers benefit from. I am a proud supporter of Canadian content and have seen firsthand the quality that we can produce here. However, I am greatly distressed by Bill C-10. Despite our prominence, we have been given zero opportunity to participate in any discussions regarding this legislation, and neither have any of our digital content and contemporaries. This is distressing because Bill C-10 directly affects digital content creators, but it is being written by people who don't understand how digital platforms work and without any consultation of those it directly impacts. The proposed bill gives no consideration to the long-term growth of the companies that have evolved from the digital landscape. I worked for close to 15 years producing series for TV broadcasters, the traditional broadcast industry. Having moved to the digital side of the industry in 2015, I understand how overwhelming this sector can be. But your lack of understanding cannot be an excuse to inhibit our industry's growth. Digital content creators are a vital and growing part of the broadcast industry, and our input should be mandatory. I do believe that government investment in quality content could lead to a strengthened Canadian broadcast industry, but Bill C-10 does not do this. Rather than the promotion and elevation, it focuses on restriction and isolation. Rather than introducing Canadian content to a global audience abroad, it focuses on removing choice from our Canadian audience here at home. You have an opportunity to raise our traditional media companies to the standard of success our digital producers are experiencing. Instead, you are choosing to antiquate digital companies. This is a step back, a step inward, and a step in the wrong direction. Mr. Chair, this letter was written to the members of this committee, and I was asked to share it today. It is with pleasure that I do, because this individual and this company, they raise a really valid point, and it's one that needs to be considered by all members of this committee. Now, I understand that we've had our squabbles, and I understand that this process might feel frustrated, but I think what needs to be rightly understood and stated here is that there is a legislative process in place within the House of Commons by which a bill is considered clause by clause, statement by statement, and it is evaluated to see whether or not it makes for good legislation. And that standard, of course, is going to be somewhat different for each party, because each party, each individual comes to the table and views this legislation through a different lens. I understand that. But what needs to also, I believe, be carried with due weight is the fact that there are tens of thousands of creators that are going to be impacted by this legislation, and their voices have not been considered. It has been said that this legislation is going to level the playing field. I would propose to the committee that it will indeed level the playing field. But rather than calling traditional broadcasters up to a higher standard where digital first creators exist, it instead insists that those digital first creators be punished for their success and be diminished, that they actually be put down to a lower standard. I don't think that's what it means to be Canadian. I don't think that's the purpose of putting or should be the purpose of putting legislation in place, that we would downgrade people, that we would enforce a standard to actually lessen their ability to create and access an audience. Instead, why wouldn't we insist on the traditional broadcasters becoming better, coming up, learning from digital first creators? Doesn't that seem innovative and creative, and doesn't that contribute to an e-commerce world that the current government has said they're committed to creating and supporting? Because right now, this legislation actually goes after those individuals who have talent, who have exercised an entrepreneurial spirit, who have been innovative and creative, and who have taken risks, who have put themselves out there and found new ways to promote their skill, their talent, their ability, their ideas, and to elicit an audience organically. This legislation then will empower the CRTC, or even call upon the CRTC to put regulations in place that will impose algorithms on these artists. And these algorithms will move their content or their creativity up or down in the queue. It will determine whether or not they get showed favoritism. Do they get to be in first place, or do they get to be in 20th place, or maybe they get to be in 200th place? Maybe they appear on the first page when you search something on YouTube, or maybe they just get to be on page 27 where they'll never be found. And for the government to dictate that is extremely detrimental to the industry and to those artists who have so effectively invested their skill, their time, their talent, and their money in order to be successful on these new platforms, this new way of being able to promote material or ideas or a skill, talent, and ability.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Ms. DeBruzen.
We're discussing an amendment about independent legal opinions, and I'm just wondering when we're going to get to that part about independent legal opinions, because we are nowhere close at this point.
Thank you, Ms. DeBruzen. Well, there are no time constraints as to when people take the floor, as we all now know. I appreciate that. Yes, it is about independent legal opinions tying into Canadian Charter of Rights Freedoms, particularly 2B. Ms. Harder is talking about online undertakings, per se. I can only assume that this will tie into the amendment as we go on further. But again, there are no time limits as to when she can do that. So, Ms. Harder, with that in mind, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, thank you for being so gracious with Ms. DeBruzen and helping her understand the credibility of my argument. This has to do with charter rights. This has to do with discoverability. This has to do with algorithms. This has to do with regulations. I'm talking about creators. And I understand that the members of this committee seem to be uncomfortable for whatever reason talking about the greatness that exists within the Canadian people who have determined to be creators on these digital first platforms. I'm unsure as to why that discomfort exists. I'm unsure as to why the members of this committee have refused to hear their voices. I'm unsure as to why the members of the government would like to force this piece of legislation through without first considering those that are going to be impacted by it in negative ways. I can only assume that there is some alternative agenda at play here, because I don't know why else. I don't know why else a government would wish to punish a good section of our population who, again, have invested time and talent and money and energy into being productive citizens, into being able to promote material that Canadians are accessing freely and enjoying. I'll also mention that they're creating an income for themselves, many of them a full-time income. More than 25,000 of those individuals who are Canadian are producing an income of over $100,000 a year. It's amazing. It's amazing. I'm just so baffled by the fact that we're not actually celebrating that as a committee. I'm baffled by a government that started out in saying that they were all for seeing the expansion of e-commerce, and yet this bill is a direct attack on that. It's a mystery to me. So here we are, with a few minutes left before the 5 hours is up, before the gag order takes full effect, before my voice, the voices of my Conservative colleagues on this committee, are quelched. But most importantly, we have a few minutes left before the voices of these tens of thousands of creators are wiped out, silenced, put into a black hole. Before the government implements regulatory measures that are either going to move them up in the queue or down in the queue, show them favoritism or punish them for their success, determine who gets to succeed and who doesn't. It's a sad day. I'll end.